very exciting set of breakfast seminars this year. We put up the number due to popular request, so there's 6 this year, and we're starting with a real bang. Last year, Simon Poole gave the ATSI, the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, title oration, and there's a few of us in the room who were present, and it was a wonderful and very inspiring speech. So I said to Simon afterwards, I want you to give that again at the breakfast seminar. So it might not be exactly the same, but it covers some of the wonderful ground. And why it's a great story in itself, and it's a really interesting. What he's going to say will certainly make me think, and I've been quoting it a bit. I won't give it away, but it is particularly timely given the Prime Minister's talk about innovation. Our new Premier's talk about it. The Innovation Council in the state has gone into is with the Deputy Premier and will be attached to the EPC. I understand, there's a few of my colleagues here who can tell me if I'm wrong about that. So, innovation is very important to Australia. But above all, Australia seems to have that history of being extraordinarily good at problem solving and research, but not good at getting commercial outcomes in the high technology area. We've got some great counter-examples, and we've got people from Cochlear here and so on, but we don't have a lot of it. And one of the things about this talk is that it actually addresses how you might do it in a very concrete way. Simon's been a figure in Australian research, entrepreneurship, in the industrial scene since, the mid-80s. Came from Southampton, was a big part of setting up and running the photonics CRC and of getting the photonics industry going in Australia. Very successful researcher, very successful inventor, and a very successful businessman. And I've known him a long time, as well as that, he's a brilliant speaker and a very generous person. So as well as leading Finisar in Australia and leading a range of companies and research laboratories, he's generous in mentoring young people, in being involved with photonics research in the universities, and getting innovation going generally. And so he's going to talk a bit about the evolution of his career. I'm not going to cover it, but Simon, welcome, and we're really looking forward to what you've got to say.
As you see, I'm a little taller than Mary. Thank you for that, Mary. It's always a hard act to follow when somebody says such wonderful things about you, so I'll do what I can. What I'm going to do today is try and walk through a series of thoughts covering the concepts behind what's up on the slide here. The idea of basically taking ideas and execution, the two halves of innovation, and using as a model for this the symbol that is very familiar to I think everybody in the room, that's the Darius Fujitsu yin-yang symbol, and use that as a way of thinking about innovation, thinking about the execution issues, and then working through looking at some of the things that we've been able to do in some of the companies I've been involved in, using that concept as a way to look at how we were reasonably successful. I think we've all read this page. This is the home page for the government's innovation statements from last year. Welcome to the ideas group. The federal government, and as Mary's been saying, the state government is very keen, and rightly so, on the ideas of ideas. So what we are used to is this concept of basically we're here for the ideas. Ideas are what the government is pushing, what is very commonly thought of as innovation. The whole concept that innovation is about the generation of ideas, and that the success follows on from ideas, whereas in fact I will be arguing and proposing that it's really a combination of the ideas and the execution of those ideas that is the critical part for successful innovation. So looking at the two sides of this, the ideas and the execution side, and comparing and contrasting those. Ideas, generally we're looking for things that are novel, things that have not been done before, new ideas, new ways of doing things. When it comes to execution though, you want things basically to be repeatable. You don't want in a manufacturing plant to come in every day and have to restart and rethink how things are done. You want things to be reproducible. And I'll be talking a lot about manufacturing in this because that's an area that I'm very strongly involved in. So there's a dichotomy here between what you want from in the ideas phase and the actual implementation, execution phase of those. Similarly for ideas, you want things ideally that are protectable, whether it's patentable, copyrightable, keeper's trade secret, something that you can protect to stop other people using that. In execution, the converse of that is you want something that's predictable. Again, you want to come in the morning, and you want your manufacturing processes to be the same as they were yesterday, and the same as they were the day before that, and be the same again tomorrow, so that you have something that is repeatable. It's a process that you can go through on the execution side of things. And finally, ideas need to be marketable. You need to have a market for your ideas, generating an idea in isolation, looking at this in an innovation, holistic way. You want something you can take into the market. You've got to have a market for this. Conversely, with the execution side, you want that market to be profitable. It's no good having a great idea, take it into the market, and then losing money forever and then fail. You need that to be profitable in some manner. You can think of the idea side of things as about the creation of intellectual property, and the execution phase being about the implementation of that intellectual property into products and processes. So when you're doing this sort of talk, the thing you have to do is you have to prove that your ideas are correct. So you generally go and do a literature review. I cheated a little bit and I did a search in Amazon on books on this subject. And it was very interesting. If you look at the books on innovation, searching in Amazon, there are 3,400 different titles that turn up. So innovation is clearly something that is very dear to people's hearts. They'll pay good money to read about. If you look for execution, there are about 300 books, most of which are about execution of strategy. They're not actually about execution of innovation, they're about execution of strategy. If you then try and say, okay, what about innovation and execution? You're down to about 38 books that talk about that, out of a total of around about 3,500 to 4,000 books. So it's not an area that has really caught people's imagination, but I think it's really the area that we need to focus on as a country if we're going to be successful. We're going to take these ideas and turn them into basically value for Australia, for the people who live here. So, to bring now this concept of the yin and yang, the Taoist Taojisu symbol, which I say we're all very familiar with. This symbol, as you can see and as you know, includes parts of each within the other. So it's a symbol which indicates wholeness, which indicates that there's interconnectedness. In fact, there are a number of things that you can talk about this symbol. Neither yin nor yang are absolute. Both of them work together, they exist together. The circles, the curves, the movements of this symbol, it indicates a sort of kaleidoscope, it indicates movement through that. It's not something that's fixed, it's something that is continuously in movement. It's not static. Then the sum of this forms a whole, it forms a completeness. And when we start to talk about ideas and execution and innovation, we're looking at a complete cycle here. And very interesting, the balance here can be skewed due to external influences. The relative strengths of either of those, the relative activities of those can be skewed according to what's happening in the external world. That's all good and true. The interesting thing comes if you replace yin and yang with ideas and execution. You think about neither ideas nor execution are absolute. Neither on their own is sufficient. You need both to be successful in innovation. the ideas and execution, they're not static, they link together, they're always linking together, they're moving together. But you need both of them to complete the whole of innovation. So we're going to use this as a model as we go forward. We're going to expand on this and look at how we can use it as a way of thinking about the innovation cycle and the product cycle. So we're going to talk about our ideas here on the left, on your left, and the execution right, the IP creation, the IP implementation, each of which contains a part of the other. So let's look at ideas. And the first thing you do is you go to the people who really know about these things, and in this case I went to Mary's speech from the Czech generation from 2 years ago, and reading that, basically, what Mary's saying, and what we see from the literature is that there's a lot of ideas around. If you take half a dozen engineers, put them in a room, they'll come up with a whole bunch of good ideas. You really give them a chance. It's not ideas that we're short of, I don't think. It's more the execution side of things that we want to focus on here. So I'm going to some extent, pull that back a little bit and focus a bit more on the execution side as we go forward. So let's look at execution. Let's see what people say about execution. Well, let's see what Seth Godin has to say. Just about every successful venture is based on an unoriginal idea, beautifully executed. I think that's probably going a little bit far the other way. I don't quite trust Seth. Any guy who wears green glasses is a little bit dodgy. He's very much a sales marketing type of guru. But there's a germ of truth in there. Execution is incredibly important, and you can be successful just on an execution basis. But let's go to the real source of wisdom. Let's go to Thomas Edison, a man well known for his bushy eyebrows and a good sense of aphorisms. Vision without execution is hallucination. I think that's a lovely way to look at it. Ideas without execution, vision without execution is just kidding itself. And we'll return to this Edison later in the process. But I think that's a very good way to start thinking about this. You have to have the execution phase. It's no good just sticking with the idea, the vision side. So let's move this now through into looking at what I call the innovation cycle. That is the process by which an idea gets turned into a product and produced. Talk about manufacturing, but it could be used from the software space, and it can be used in services as well. So the start of it here on our idea side of the Tajisu is the process of idea generation and testing. This is where you're trying out the new ideas, where you're looking at seeing what works, testing it possibly with some trial customers. Basically, the process which is closest to the research end of things. Moving up from that, you then go into a product development phase, where you're actually taking those ideas and trying to quantify and solidify those to the point where you've actually got a product that you can think of. And you can see as we go around this, as you come around here, you're starting to now include in here some of the execution phase. You've got to start thinking about execution within that product development phase. It's no good developing the product if you can't work, if you then can't make it afterwards. Following product development, there's the process of new product introduction. That is the process of taking from engineering, from R&D, through into your manufacturing or production phase. What we call NPI, new product introduction. And here, now, the importance of the execution phase grows and grows until you are fully into your production cycle. But no product lasts forever. So within this process, you have to have also the genesis of the next stage, the next part of your innovation, and then continue around the cycle again and again and again if you're going to be successful. No company can survive on one product forever. So we're going to take this innovation cycle and we're going to be looking at this as applied to a couple of companies I've been involved in. The first one, take a little side detour into intellectual property, because IP is a very contentious, litigious area, particularly once you get successful. If you're not successful, it's not a problem. It's when you get successful, we start having problems with IP. We've spent a lot of time dealing with patent trolls and so on over the last few years as we've become successful, but until we were, nobody gave a damn. So let's talk about embodied IP. We usually think about embodied energy. We think about the idea that you can basically sum up all the energy that's been put into a product, into any goods or services, and that's the embodied energy. And the aim is to minimise that embodied energy. We really want to reduce our energy usage and so on. The difference, though, is that for innovation, when we're trying to be successful in our innovation process, our ideas, our knowledge need to be turned into something tangible, these patents, processes, copyright, circuit design, software. And what we really need to do there is we actually need to embody this into the product that we're making. We need to maximise that embodied IP. So it's the inverse of the energy problem where you're trying to minimise your embodied energy. Here you want to maximise your usage of IP, the protection you get from that IP, whether it is patents, know-how, manufacturing know-how. And by maximising that, you maximise the chance of you being able to continue and successfully manufacture that product. Which leads us on to manufacturing. One of the things that we're often told within Australia is there's no chance of us ever doing manufacturing because China's just too good. China is good at manufacturing, but it's not unbeatable. And there are things that we can do and things that we can work with, which actually play to our advantage, but we need to understand the roadmap. So China is fabulous, really good at making stable, standard products with atomisable process that you can teach somebody in a couple of hours. People sitting on the line, working stuff down. Great at that. The low wages really helps. That means you can have a product with high touch time and you can put high volume through a line like that. That really works well in China. You just look at Foxconn, things they're doing there as an example. And I'm using China as an example for Asia. It's just the largest one by just sort of an order of magnitude compared to anybody else that's out. In Australia, what we're actually pretty good at is the process of mass customisation, the ability to build small volumes to medium volumes of differentiated products. That's actually our strength. It plays to our very high level of education, it plays to our skill sets. But conversely, we can't have something with high touch time. We can't have something that somebody has to spend hours doing a little tiny adjustment on. You need things that have a high return on your touch time because of the cost of wages. It's roughly 10x per hour between Australia and China. So again, we need to have value add as well. That's the other part of the equation. Low touch time, high value add is successful manufacturing that you can do here in Australia. And bringing up the rear on this, but very important for product success, is this concept of a high embodied IP. You need something that you can't just take and copy. If it's tapeable and copyable, somebody will do it somewhere, usually in China. It's facts of life and we have to live with that. So what does this mean for Australia as a country when we're trying to deal with the manufacturing might of China and our capabilities and our strengths? Firstly, and I can be a little bit controversial here, I don't believe Australia can be a high volume, global scale manufacturer of low cost parts and goods. We just do not have the infrastructure, the ecosystem, or the wage structure that allows us to do that. We have to recognise that, and we have to basically move on and continue to focus on the concepts around high value add products with these high levels of embodied IP. We're great at generating IP. We need to make sure we're capturing that and turning it into products that are valued in the market, are protectable, and are very, very hard to copy. But on the other hand, we've got China and Southeast Asia sitting there as a volume manufacturer. We need to use those strengths, take what comes out of there, value add to what's coming out of China, and use them for the base high touch time assembly processes, and leverage that with our high value add capabilities at the back end of the process. That's the model that I think is one that will work and that we've used within my company as a way to leverage our capabilities and create a sustainable high value add business. that was a brief sort of overview of the structure of thinking about innovation manufacturing. What I want to do now is to shift gears a bit and start talking about some specific implementations, looking at the telecoms industry, which is the one that I've been involved with for far too long, and looking at how we take basically those concepts and apply them into companies and actual manufacturing operations. So as the slide says, telecom is all about mobile video. We're looking around the audience, we're of an age group where mostly it's our children who are the ones who are driving the internet bandwidth, unless we all really love kitten videos. It's basically consumption of videos on mobile devices that is driving the growth of the internet, driving communications, driving the whole optical networking industry that I'm a part of. It is that which you can see growing. This is some data from Cisco. It says it's around 20 to 25% per annum data growth. There's some data I got yesterday from Bell Labs that says it's about twice that. I don't quite understand the difference, but it's big. Something that's growing at 25% to 50% a year is a major industry growing very, very fast. And what does an optical network look like? Well, here's one I've chosen as an example. This is from NBN Co. This is their Australian network. And what you see is it's basically a lot of individual fibre loops all interconnected around the place, serving primarily the eastern seaboard. This is actually a really interesting, almost fractal map. If you keep digging down deeper and deeper into Sydney, for example, you just see more and more of these networks on denser and denser scale. It's a really interesting sort of way of looking at things. This was a couple of years ago now, 60,000 kilometres, 100 interconnected optical fibre rings around Australia. And the same sort of network is replicated all around the world at different scales depending on which country we're in. It's basically optical fibre everywhere in the backbone. Similarly, for undersea cables. This is a map from a couple of years ago, believe it or not. I know it looks about 140 years old, but it's actually from 2 years ago. And what this shows is all of the optical fibre cables around the world in submarine networks. Both transatlantic, trans-Pacific, very interesting in Africa. The submarine cables do what's called a ribbon cable around the outside, just doing drop-offs into each individual country, obviously for security and continuity reasons. And Australia's down here has a bunch of cables coming up primarily into Southeast Asia and across up here through into the US. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we go. But a lot of optical fibre cables. So the value chain underpins this. Basically, the top says the people who watch videos, whether it's Netflix or YouTube or your Facebook videos or Snapchat or whatever you do, it's video that drives it, and it's the home consumers. Business is about 15% of total internet traffic, home consumers about 85%. Totally dominated by video. Supporting those are basically our telecom and service providers, Telstra, Optus, NBN, TVT, Chorus, and underpinning those are the people who make the equipment, the transmission equipment manufacturers who supply the equipment into the telcos, who provide the connectivity to us. Companies like Cisco, Fujitsu, Huawei, who are now the biggest global optical communications provider. And since we're focusing on optical, right down at the bottom here is the companies that nobody's ever heard of, who are the component and subsystem manufacturers. These guys sitting on the faceplates. Nobody knows they exist unless you're in the industry. But it's about a $10 billion a year business down at the bottom there. The total business value there, the services business, for example, is about a $3.4 trillion business at the top, underpinned by these optical components sitting at the bottom. And it's this area down here that I'm going to be talking about. These are some of the companies I've been involved with. As I said, 3.4 trillion, 3.9 trillion, equipment's about 400 billion in the components, and subsystems down here at 30. And this is a really interesting graph if you're in the business of trying to make money as a telco. It's a really scary graph as well. This graph here shows that growth. This is 28%, slightly different data set, showing the internet traffic as a function of time. Just to point out, internet traffic totally dominates voice now. There is no voice traffic to talk of. But the revenue has hardly changed in a decade. So the amount of data that's being carried by the telcos has increased by a factor of about 6. Their revenue has increased by about 5 to 10%. There's obviously a huge cost capacity crunch there. And this isn't a new phenomenon. This has been happening now for 20 or 30 years, that the rate of increase of data is way in excess of the rate of increase of revenues. So there's a huge pressure to get costs out of the networks, massive pressure. And this is where the component guys come into play. This is where we'll be talking for pretty much the next part of the talk, is about how some of these components operate into that network and how that plays out. So a bit of technology. This is the only technology, well, one of 2 technology slides. This is basically how optical fibre works these days. It's not a laser in at one end, a piece of fibre and a receiver at the other end. It is a whole bunch of different lasers, each of different wavelengths or colours, which are multiplexed together in what's called a wavelength division multiplexer, down the fibre and then split out at the other end. So instead of one signal, you can get up to 100 signals down in a given optical fibre. And combining that with a thing called an optical fibre amplifier, which basically acts as an optical version of electrical amplifier, so you amplify optical signals. That's the basis for all of the telecommunications and optical networks I showed earlier, all based on this wavelength division multiplex, WDM technology. So to Index, this was a company that started out in 1995 as a spin-out from the Australian Photonics Cooperative Research Centre at Sydney University. And it made things called optical fibre Bragg gratings. Now, fibre Bragg grating, all the physicists here will know what that is. But of course, the William Bragg being Australia's Nobel Prize winner in physics for basic X-ray diffraction. It's a derivative of the knowledge of that. It's basically a way of filtering light using refractive, diffractive techniques. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but think of it as a very narrow band optical filter. Started out in '95 as a spin-out from the Photonics Research Centre, and every company has had a secret sauce when they're a technology push, which this was. And the secret sauce for this was basically temperature-independent packaging. That is, these fibre Bragg gratings, and what I've got here is basically a plot in this axis of the wavelength of the grating. So what is the centre frequency? And as a function of temperature. And if you take a standard grating in an optical fibre, it moves like crazy. It makes a fabulous sensor, but it's not very good if you want a nice stable telecommunications system. So what you need to do is you need to stabilise it, which you do with the packaging. And that was what we did in Index. We took fairly well-known technologies for fibre Bragg gratings, and we then developed this temperature-independent packaging, so they're really, really stable. And at the time, that wasn't possible. We were the first company to do that. Now let's look at how that innovation cycle worked for a startup coming out of the university. Remember, we've got our innovation cycle here, our idea generation, our product development, product introduction and production. For Index, what we did is we actually used the research out of the CRC right back here at the idea generation and testing phase. So the research was this part, the first part of that process. If you talk to the researchers, they thought they went about as far as here, but in practice, the reality is that's where the researchers got to. I know I was one of the researchers, so I can't sort of damn the faint praise there. When we first started, we thought we were a lot more advanced than we were. Turns out that what a university researcher thinks of as a product is not the same as what a company or a customer thinks of as a product, generally speaking. And so we actually had significantly further to go than we realised when we started the company to get from this point of the ideas through to the development and product introductions and production stage. This really shows two things. One is it shows where researchers, universities are really good at, which is down at this end here. It also shows what they don't do, which is this part here, and I think it's generally a good idea that the university part focuses down here and that this part is done outside of the university environment. I know that some people would disagree with that, but that's, from my experience, the best way that this thing would work. And once we got the first product through, then we had the point where we had a critical mass of staff. We had a few dozen staff, and we could start this process again, but we didn't need the university within that second phase and so on, because we were self-generating, coming out of the products coming from, and ideas coming from customers. So it was a really good start to Index, but then it changed once we became a self-running company. Now, I mentioned earlier these cables that come out of Australia. This is a cable called CBW3. It starts off up here in Japan, comes all the way down through Southeast Asia, around up through the Red Sea, through the Mediterranean, up into Europe. Southeast Asia, Mediterranean, Western Europe. This was, until about 2 years ago, the longest cable system in existence, 39,000 kilometres of cable sitting on the bottom of the ocean, including this big spur down here at Perth. And that's actually what the 2000 Olympics, the broadcast for that actually went up through CBW3 out to the rest of the world. The reason this is up here is because this was our first big business win as a company, as Index. We actually made fibre gratings that went into each of these what are called branching points. So this is where light that's coming down through the fibre gets routed out to a landing point and back again. So it's basically a way of dropping off signals to individual countries and locations. And Index, when we started this program, was a 5-person company, living off selling gratings to researchers. And we finished up basically having to make gratings which had incredible reliability. And we talk in terms of fits, failures in 10 hours. And the gratings that we had to make, because these things are sitting at the bottom of the ocean, okay, they're 3,000 feet, 3,000 metres down. If one of these things breaks, there is hell. It kills the whole system. And we had to make 200 of these things. And the failure rate is 1 failure in 10 to the 10 hours, which is about a failure every million years. And we had to guarantee that to Fujitsu. It wasn't a small company, it was a big company called Fujitsu, and their customers, people like Telstra and AT&T, British Telecom. And so all that pressure comes cascading down into a little 5-person company in Australia. The amazing thing was, though, there was an incredible team, and we actually managed to do this. We actually bid against US and Japanese competitors on this, who were several times our size. But our technology, derived from the technology coming out of university, improved by Index, actually was better than anybody else's out there. And this was a tremendous capability, tremendous win. There's a whole another story to tell about that, which I won't do in this location, but we should do at some point. So we completed that contract, started December 1997, just over 2 years after we started. It was $1 million contract. We had to deliver gratings on schedule every 2 weeks for 6 months, because you're building these gratings into a damn long cable. They've got to feed into the line, into the cable, and they get coiled in the big drums to go on the ship later into the ocean. It was a really stressful period for everybody involved. And then 6 days later, we sold the company. That was a deliberate ploy. It wasn't just an opportunistic. We've been working on it for some time, but we recognised that there were limitations to what we could do out of Australia in terms of market access. We needed a bigger partner. And we basically sold to a company called Uniphase, and the money from that was used to start basically the Redfern group of companies that came on after us. And then the company grew like topsy. We continued to make these fibre grade gratings for undersea systems. And by 2001, we were about 330 people up at North Ryde, doing about 60 million US and 100 million Aussie at the time, all in exports, and serving the undersea market. And then along came the telecom crash, and the telecom bubble burst in 2003. The whole thing was shut down and went away. Basically, the market went away. There was so much optical fibre put into the ocean and into the ground during the 1999-2001. Nobody wanted to build anything for a few years. We couldn't afford to run a company with no revenues, so the whole thing got shut down. Some of the technology got sort of recycled, and a bunch of universities got an awful lot of equipment donated to them very quickly, because there was a lot of equipment there at the time. But it's the story of the life cycle. There was just literally no market at that point. And the market is the critical thing when it comes to successful technology. So I'd actually left in about 2001 and said to my wife at the time, there's no way I'm ever going to do that startup. I'm exhausted, I just want to go lie on the beach and have a life and all those other things. So I left in 2001, and 3 months later started a company called Engana. It wasn't planned. There was just a guy called Steve Friskin, who some people here will know, who's an absolute genius. And I've always wanted to work with him, but his company was just closing down for the same reasons. And so we started a company called Engana, which is about intelligent optical subsystems for reconfigurable networks. What the hell does that mean? Basically, it means that you're taking not just these filtering things that we talked about, graded narrow filters, but making them intelligent and making them reconfigurable. So instead of being fixed, you can tune them and putting some intelligence around them so that the operators can control them with software rather than having with knobs and things on the side. This was a concept that we basically dreamt up over 3 very good bottles of wine sitting at the kitchen table. And at the time, there was no market for reconfigurable networks. That didn't exist. We just knew that had, well, we knew because we now know that it did. At the time, we believed that that was going to happen in sometime in the next few years. And so we had no technologies. This wasn't a technology push. This was a market pull. We started the company with no technology, just an idea. And we then had to go and work out what that technology was going to be. So let's just explain a bit about what a reconfigurable optical network looks like. This is a simple network. This is the RNet network. It's much simpler than the one we saw for NVMK. Just a few spurs and a couple of rings. And this is pretty much what networks looked like in 2001 when we started the company. This is a network of 10 to 15 years ago with a major telco. RNet needs to be simple because it's not trying to deal with the complexities of a massive residential network. Comparing that to our NVMK, where you've got all of these interconnections, it's a very different looking network. And this is what we were aiming for when we started in Ghana. And the aim here is basically, you've got these points of interconnection, and you need to switch signals through there as efficiently as possible. Typically, and historically, this was done electrically. You had electrical routers from people like Cisco, very expensive, very high energy consumption, and limited capacity. Only a few hundred gigabits per second on the very top CR1 routers. What we want to do with Engana, though, was to actually switch light rather than electrical. So we're switching light between these, which will be much more efficient. I'll explain how in a minute. So we started in September 2001. Totally market focused. We used to call it the technology-free zone. We don't have any technology, we don't have any technology until we know it's the right one for the market. So very different from the university startup. Somehow, despite all of this, we managed to get some VC funding into this. Thanks to whoever for the guys who backed us in doing that. 6 million in the Series A and 8 million in the Series B, despite it being sort of in the downturn of the telecom crash. And we got our first product out. It was actually a tunable version of that filter I talked about earlier, just a tunable optical filter. The only trouble is that nobody wanted it. Well, they did, but they probably only wanted about $3 million a year's worth. And as we've just taken in over $10 million of investment, that was never going to fly with our investors. So we basically did what is nowadays called a pivot, but in those days was called an oh-shit moment, and switched products and technologies in mid-flow. And developed what is now become our core product, which is a wavelength selective switch based on a technology called liquid crystalline silicon, an LCOS, which is not something we invented, it's something that we basically borrowed. So what's a wavelength selective switch? Well, as I said earlier, it's this point where we have multiple networks connected. You want to route different colours of signals around the network. You do that with a thing called a wavelength selective switch. And so it allows network operators to manage their network balance, manage their network capacity. Great, I say that's good. There's probably half a dozen of those in Australia. That's not true. They're somewhere now round about getting close to 500,000 of these WSS installed globally. A few thousand of those within Australia. So what you think is a relatively sort of esoteric part of the network is actually an increasingly moving closer and closer and closer to the consumer. So most, all of the points of interconnecting in the NBN will have these, all of the major network hubs will have these, all the major telephone exchanges have these. And we use this technology, liquid crystalline silicon. This is the other technology slide, okay? So LCOS, liquid crystalline silicon, is something that we borrowed. It was developed in the late 90s for projection TV. Now, people of a certain age will remember the big projection TVs, particularly in the US, that were about 6 foot high, 3 foot wide, and 4 foot deep, and had a big projection CRT in the bottom of it onto a slightly grainy screen. The idea was that these LCOS chips would replace that projector CRT. And somewhere around $250 million was invested by companies like Intel, LG, Sony in this LCOS technology because they thought silicon displays, fabulous, let's do it. Unfortunately, along came plasmas and flat screen LCDs and wiped out totally the projection TV market. You've still got projectors like this one here, but that's a very small market compared to the home TV market. So this technology then languished. And we basically went out and acquired that technology from the startups that have failed. We can use this technology, we can create patterns or switch light in the way that this thing goes. The light comes in, you put the right pattern on here, and you can change the direction of the light comes out of it and use that to switch it. The great thing about this is it's just basically a display, so you can use display technology, computer drivers and so on for driving. And we now use this as our platform for all of our LCOS. So, Finisar Australia. We built our platform on this, and then we were acquired before we sold everything. Again, this was part of the plan. The best time to sell a company is either when you've got a lot of revenue and a lot of profits, or just before you have any revenue. Anywhere in between, your valuation isn't going to be enough. It's just before revenue. It's all blue sky. Once you start selling anything, you're valued on a multiple of revenue or multiple of profits, and the valuation goes through the floor. So we sold just before we had product. We had product in the market, but we were just pre-revenue. Bought by a company called Optium, who then went public 6 months later on NASDAQ, and then were acquired by Finisar in 2008. So we went from Engana t-shirt to Optium t-shirt and hoodie, and into Finisar we got a t-shirt, a hoodie and a bezel cap. Make Finisar great again. Now, we're now a subsidiary of Finisar Corporation, who are the world's largest optical components manufacturer, about a $1.5 billion a year company based out of Sunnyvale, California. And we in Australia are now the largest manufacturer of these wavelength selective switches in the world. We have about 40% market share in 2016. We're still at about that level. We've got revenues somewhere around about 160 million a year sort of level coming out of our factory in Rosewood. And this is just the sort of a series of products. This is the sort of historical translation of products from simple to small to slightly larger but very complicated to small and even more complicated. And there's another one due out end of this year. That's an ongoing loop through that innovation cycle. We're continually having to go through learning from our mistakes in production, learning from our mistakes in development, learning from our mistakes in the market. We're going through that innovation cycle again and again. So we've done about $850 million of total revenues out of the company now. All of that's for export. We are in all the Australian networks, but we've never sold into Australia. We sell to the people who make telecoms equipment, Siemens, the Huawei's, the Fujitsu's of this world. We've got about 240, I think it is now, just ramped up a little, in Rosebery. We do have manufacturing there. As I said earlier, we use this leveraging effect where we have manufacturing in China, then we have manufacturing in Australia. The low value add, high touch time in China, the high value add, low touch time, the customisation, if you like, here in Australia. And so let's look at the cycle as we came to Finisar. And we've still got this concept here of Itaijitsu with idea generation, product development, production through, and then round again. So we've been this is our fifth generation going round this loop now. And we've learnt the things that need to go into here, we've learnt what needs to go in here, and I wish that we could execute it perfectly every time, but that's the reality, is that we're still learning. So how do we do this now? Well, initially this was all done in Sydney. We were an Australian-based, wholly Australian-based company. But because of this big cost down pressure, our costs, you remember that graph of increasing data and flat revenues, that means the costs have got to come down. In this case, it's costs of equipment. We have to drop our prices 15% a year for everything that we make. It's expected, it's common knowledge. I'm not saying anything out of school that's not known within the industry. And that's a really painful thing to do. So something that we started selling 5 years ago for $10,000, we're now selling that for exactly the same thing for $4,000. And we weren't making 90% margins at the start of the year. So there's a huge pressure on getting cost out, going through this cycle, not just of the full product, but also incremental product changes, getting cost out, improving manufacturing processes, and improving the way we do business. Which is where we have to use this leveraging of China, which is really important to our business model. So what we do is we have our ideas generation sits in Sydney. We have a new product introduction. That is when we have a new product coming into production, we do that in Sydney. And then when that product reaches a certain volume, we ship the whole line up to China and replicate that line multiple times. So we have a single startup product introduction line in Sydney. Once that's established, we've shaken the bugs out of the system, and that's really important because it's really hard supporting product line development in China. Then ship that up to China. There's a group up there that will replicate that line and run the production lines for us. That allows us to be competitive. We couldn't do it otherwise. Why is that? Well, here's a picture of the thing that we get made in China. It's got lots of little bits of glass, very precisely stuck onto a precision base board. Here's our LCOS chip sitting underneath. It's all stuck in a hermetic package. We use this standard unit across multiple products. So we have a single unit that is made in China for this particular design. It's used in 80% of our products. So it's a very, very high volume thing. The precision is such that it's very hard to automate the processes. Ideally, we could automate, just do pick and place like you do for electronics, just studying things off the circuit board. But it doesn't work like in optics. The precision required is too great, it's too iterative. And so we have something where there's 20 hours of touch time per unit. So, in Chinese, that's about $100. In Australia, that would be close to $500 to $1,000 worth of touch time that we'd have to, the cost that we have in the unit. That we just could not afford to keep that in there. So we put this part of it in China. All of those units then get shipped back to Sydney as basic in-feed materials into the final beast. So here's the optical unit sitting here, and it goes on to electronics with some optics, and in here's a whole lot of software, calibration, and so on we do in Sydney. But what we have is we have the ability to customise this hardware and software. So connectors here, every customer wants a different connector, every customer wants different software, every customer wants different versions of different software for different products. Instead of having one nice simple product that we build in very high volume, we have about 120 different products, all of which have this same piece of optics inside them. So we have found a way to basically take the strength of China, which is high volume, single, make one thing and make it well. And Australia, which is to customise through appropriate use of software, hardware, and good manufacturing systems to get this down to 2 hours local touch time. And we still get the revenue out of Australia. So we buy in as a big, and we have a lot of value into Australia. So to conclude, innovation needs both the idea side of things, which we're generally very good at, and the execution, which we are at this stage less good. There are exciting examples of contradiction to that, but generally I think that we are much better at ideas than our execution. These are complementary, they are both necessary, and neither, as a mathematician would agree, is sufficient. So you need to have both of these to be a successful player, to be a first world economy going forward. The key to successful manufacturing on a sustainable basis is embodied IP. Within that product, there is over 1 million lines of code that actually sits inside that product, and about the same in the manufacturing systems. So there is a massive investment in software, embodied IP in that product. You can't see it because it's all microcode that's inside it. And that's what we need to do. We need to embody the IP in Australia, and we need to leverage the strengths of China in growing our manufacturing base in a way that's sustainable and appropriate for an economy like Australia's. And finally, to return to Mr. Edison, another wonderful quote I'm sure everybody knows: genius is 100% inspiration, 99% perspiration. It was almost correct. It's actually execution is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, but my God, it's an important part of the equation. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Really interested in the cost-saving aspect. You're obviously based in Rosebery, Sydney. It's a very expensive city. Would you look at moving regionally?
No.
And why not?
Okay, I'll explain why. It was very hard for us to move to Rosebery. It was a little bit far from the train line. We have 110 engineers, 30 PhDs in the centre, in our group, and we rely absolutely on the human capital within the company to be able to do what we do. If we have to relocate, we would lose the majority of that human capital, and the company would not be viable. Now, I joke about it. We were at Startup and Technology Park at Netherley, and we were there for the first 8 years, and everybody loved it because it was right next to the train line and engineers and people coming. Then we moved a little bit further away to Alexandria, and everybody whinged a bit because they had to walk a little bit further from the station. And literally coming down to Everley, coming down to Rosebery, which is a 20-minute walk from Green Square Station, so it's not the end of the world. The amount of complaints and problems that we had with people is, I'm here to bus to the station with this and with that. It unfortunately wouldn't work for us to take this to a regional. If we started in a regional location, I think it could work. You could build up the knowledge base. Possibly. The trouble is, it's a very specialised knowledge base, and within Sydney we have a number of universities that we feed staff in from. There are other manufacturing companies, Cochlear, Resolute and so on, that we share staff with, re-punishing each other's. But you know, there is a base here, not a huge base compared to, say, if you go down to something like Irvine in the US, because massive optoelectronics companies around. But there is a base that exists here that we leverage off. So unfortunately, no.
All right, 1 more question.
I talk to you.
No?
Noting that you're working with Huawei, Ashley Linson, noting that you're working with Huawei in China, or they're in the space, how do you prevent your intellectual property, your embodied IP that's in that box, from getting lost to potential competitors in Wuxi or around China?
That is a really good question, and it's one that we fight all the time. There's a number of things that we do. For our components in here, there's a whole bunch of different optical components. We spread those around for different suppliers, so no one supplier has knowledge of all the things that go into it, and we swap those around on a regular basis. For key components, like the LCOS here, and there's a grading here. We actually bought companies that make those so that we control those in-house. For the software, we make very sure that the key manufacturing software sits on servers here in Sydney that aren't even connected to the company internet, let alone the external internet, so nobody can access those. And our design software, similarly, we have our Chinese manufacturing plants, they can only see the little bit that they need to see for the actual assembly. There's always the chance that companies will come and try and poach, it's part of their business, and that does happen occasionally. But again, we try and manage our staff so that they are comfortable and happy where they are. We can't always make everybody happy all the time, but it's a very important part of human capital. As I said, it's so critical to us. It's a big part of what we worry about. So it's this way of, you atomise the problem and put the key bits as far away from the real world as you can, protected by as many layers as you can. Now, we had a problem earlier. We didn't have the presentation. My laptop's locked down so tight I can't write to a USB stick. So, there's things like there's no computer in the company can write to USB sticks. It makes it a pain if you're a travelling sales guy, but it really does stop people. Just grabbing stuff and sticking it on there. Can't access external email. There's a whole bunch of really carefully locked down stuff, which is even tighter in China. So we lock down China even tighter than we do Australia or the US.
A big thank you for a wonderful talk, and a big thank you on behalf of both the audience here.